Most people seem to agree that the 17 WCA events are among the most polished, unique, and interesting puzzle-solving experiences that you can have as a cuber. But what if I told you that while less polished, the non-WCA cubes might actually be more fun? Here's why.
To put it simply, non-WCA puzzles subvert expectations very, very well. In my opinion, better than WCA events. You've probably heard of this topic of subverting expectations, probably in association with a movie, a book, or a video game. Usually in a movie or book it involves some sort of plot twist, or in a game the tone of the game changing very quickly, or the gameplay style changing, or something that you have to do, changing. That's basically what it is. But you've probably never heard of it with Rubik's Cubes, and you're probably asking, how does this tie into cubing and Rubik's Cubes? Well, I make everything tie into Rubik's Cubes, except maybe my shoelaces. I've never really tried that before. To understand what I mean when I say that non-WCA cubes subvert expectations very, very well, we're going to be looking at 4 of my personal favorite non-WCA cubes in my collection. These all have their own unique way of subverting expectations, and hopefully by looking at them individually, you'll be able to understand what makes non-WCA puzzles so good. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Mirror 2x2, the Ready Minx, the Pure Minx Duo, and the 10x10. Most WCA puzzles aren't exactly interesting visually. Most of them feature the same 6-color scheme: white, yellow, red, blue, green, orange, etc. The only exceptions to this are Pure Minx, Clock, and Mega Minx. Pure Minx and Clock subtract a few colors, and Mega Minx adds a few. So, overall, the only difference between these ones are basically the sizes and piece shapes, which, once you see them for a couple times, aren't exactly super crazy or anything. Maybe from a non-cuber's perspective, things like Mega Minx are super amazing looking and cool, and the shape shifting on square one is amazing and all that stuff. But honestly, they're not super interesting once you get used to them. But all of that flies out of the window once you get into non-WCA cubes, which are more often than not very visually interesting. A great example of this is the Mirror 2x2, as well as just the Mirror 3x3. The Mirror 2x2 completely gets rid of any sort of 6-color scheme and just gets rid of color altogether. Instead, you have to solve it by the piece shapes. Not only does this make an interesting solving experience, it also adds a layer of visual flair, a little wow factor, if you will. This is especially apparent when you compare the Mirror 2x2 to its origin event, Regular 2x2. Regular 2x2 is basically a luck-based event that is pretty standard, and once you know how to solve the 3x3, you can pretty much do it easily, and there's just a lot of alg learning. But with this, it's more about the visuals and looking at it and trying to figure out based on these shapes, because it's something completely different from a WCA event is. I also like the fact that it's not immediately apparent that it's a 2x2 when first looking at it. You could give this to someone who is at least slightly experienced with cubing, and they may not even realize that it's a 2x2 until after you solve it. So that just adds more to the visual subverting expectations factor. Of course, this is far from the only visually interesting non-WCA puzzle. In fact, there's a lot more that are much more visually interesting and exotic than this one. I mainly chose this cube because of its simplicity and the fact that its gimmick totally changes the prospect of the event it was based on. 2x2 is a fairly mediocre event by most people's standards, but this, with this one simple gimmick of removing the colors and instead relying on shapes, totally changes the prospect of the event. At their core, the speed-solving methods used to solve cited WCA events are all fairly similar. Don't believe me? Let me break it down for you. The core of most speed-solving methods starts with intuition. You'll start by matching up pieces or building blocks or making pairs until a point where intuition is inefficient or unreasonable. At that point, you'll use a set of learned algorithms to solve certain cases. Rinse and repeat this process until you're finished with the solve. Concepts like commutators and conjugates may be at the core of these speed-solving methods, but they're certainly not at the forefront, and they're not used on the fly, at least not in cited events. You could argue that in blindfolded events, they are used, and yes, that is true that they are used in advanced solves, but I would like to argue that in that case, they're more like algorithms because they're essentially memorized sequences instead of doing them on the fly. But all of this flies out the window when we come to the Ready Minx. The Ready Minx is a very interesting puzzle. It's kind of a combination of the Mega Minx and the Ready Cube. You could probably tell that based on the name. What makes the Ready Minx method unique is how intuitive it is. I don't use a single algorithm throughout this entire solve. But also, it's because of the type of intuition it uses. Near the beginning stages, there's a lot of cycling around pieces. It kind of feels like a commutators type of thing, which is completely different from something that you would see in a 3x3 solve when there's more traditional block building. But this is far from the biggest example of commutator usage in this solve. This is kind of just similar, but there's a very blatantly obvious example near the end of the solve. Once you get to the last layer, that's when things really get interesting, because then you basically have to use edge commutators on the fly. And that's something that you basically never do in a cited WCA event. So it's kind of crazy that this is the one place that you would really do it, although I suppose there are other places that you would do it. So it actually is very satisfying to finally figure this out, and it's a very unique thing compared to WCA events. The goal of every single WCA event except for multi-blind and FMC is to solve it as quickly as possible. There's no real other goal besides this. Maybe the blind events sort of have a goal of just completing it when it comes to like 5 blind and 4 blind, but those events have been so ridiculously optimized that that's not really going to cut it anymore. But all of that, as you could probably guess, flies out the window when we come to the Pyraminx duos. Now I know what you're thinking. This is an extremely easy puzzle that my grandma can solve and it takes like 4 moves in 2 seconds and blah blah blah, why is this in the video? Well, you kind of answered it yourself. This is an extremely easy puzzle. Solving it in terms of speed solving would be trivial and luck-based. And besides that, at least the one I have, is very bad hardware-wise. But it just so happens that this puzzle naturally lends itself to a completely different type of solving. Before we get into that, however, here's a little bit of context. Solving a WCA puzzle in the optimal amount of moves once, let alone consistently, is near impossible. Even in the event designed around solving a 3x3 as efficiently as possible, FMC, or Fused Moves Challenge, getting even close to the optimal amount of moves is a huge achievement. By the way, the optimal amount of moves for a 3x3 averages around 18 moves, and the cap of it is 20. So there's some context for you. Even in the shortest events, like 2x2, Pyraminx, and Skew, where the average amount of optimal moves is like 6 or 7, doing that consistently is not a thing you can really do. But it flies out the window, guys, because this thing averages about 4 moves optimally, and that is just about the perfect amount so that you can consistently solve it optimally. It is a bit of a challenge to do that, but that perfectly lends itself to that being the point of it. Instead of just solving it as fast as you can, trying to find the most optimal move solution possible for this thing is so fun. So fun. It's absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, if you haven't already caught on to this, yes, I am structuring the video in a way where I like each non-WCA puzzle better than the last one I talked about. So this next one is going to be my favorite non-WCA puzzle ever. And that grand award, of course, goes to none other than the 10x10 Rubik's Cube. But first, some context / flying out of windows. WCA cubes require the same types of skills, just in varying degrees. Things like turns per second, look ahead, alg learning, efficiency, things like that are all used across the WCA events. There's only really a few select skills that you really need. You just need them in different quantities for different events. But all of that, do I even need to say it anymore? Anyways, 10 by 10. The 10 by 10 introduces a few new skills that are not really present in the WCA events that you really need to be good at it. One of those is endurance. Yes, there are 2 hour-long WCA events, multi-blind and fused moves challenge. But in both of those, it feels more like you're working against the timer and you're focused on other parts of it rather than the endurance aspect. But with this one, which I average around 25 minutes on, it's all about that endurance. It's really nice to have an endurance event or a long event as sort of a change of pace from the overall fairly short WCA events. So that's something that I really like about it, is that you really have to stay focused and you really have to not really get distracted by anything or be like, oh, I'm too tired to go on. I also like how much time you can really kill with this thing if you do a few solves, but none of it feels repetitive or annoying. It just is the right amount of challenge to your endurance and stamina to be worth it. This would normally be where I would end this segment of the video, but I just need really quick to talk about the 10 by 10 because I did call it my favorite non-WCA cube, so I need to live up to that. So here we go. Okay, the 10 by 10 is just amazing. It's like a perfect balance of long and short to the point where it still feels like an endurance challenge, but it's not absolutely ridiculous. I know not everyone is a fan of these longer events, but I just really like them. Even though it can be a little bit repetitive sometimes, it's not super repetitive or anything. And it's just the perfect balance. And when you finally solve this, and especially if you get a new PB, it is like extremely satisfying.
Well, there we go. That is why I like non-WCA cubes so much. Summed up in 4 cubes. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed. I really enjoyed making this video because it was kind of interesting to look at how non-WCA cubes subvert expectations, because I had always liked non-WCA cubes, but I never really closely examined them as I did in this video. Now, I know it sounded like I was kind of bashing the WCA events a lot in this video, but believe me, I actually really enjoy them, and I think they're really polished experiences. And on top of that, I think they're really, really, really good at flying out of windows. In fact, they've sort of inspired me to try to fly out of the window. So here we go.
1 moment later.
Well, that was a terrible idea.